Good afternoon. Welcome to the January monthly policy update. I see that folks are just coming in from the waiting room. We're glad to have you with us this afternoon. Let me give folks just 30 seconds to gather. And we do want to respect all of your time, those of you who are able to join at the top of the hour. So let's get started. Again, welcome to the January monthly policy update. I'm Ben Kershaw. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations here at IS. If you're joining us for the first time on an IS webinar, welcome. IS is a national membership organization representing a diverse set of nonprofits, foundations, corporate giving programs, all working to ensure that all people living in the United States thrive. As part of our webinar feature, your lines are muted. We'll pause for questions periodically, but you are more than welcome to drop them in the Q&A box as we go along. If you have technical difficulties, email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. Before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C. It's the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. Also, many of the buildings we inhabit in Washington, D.C. were built by enslaved people. So I did want to acknowledge that. Wherever you are joining us from, welcome. We're really glad to have you. I am joined today by Wes Coolum, as ever, our trusted partner, and the managing director at Washington Council, Ernst & Young. I'm also joined by a special guest, Greg Eaton, who is the managing director of EY's Insurance and Federal Claims Services practice. You can see Greg's bio on the website, so I won't belabor it, but suffice to say, he's one of the foremost experts on FEMA relief for nonprofits. Greg has some, I think, really interesting and important information to share with us this afternoon. We'll have our usual update on the burning issues of the day for the charitable sector and the people we serve after we hear from Greg. But I think it's really important Greg is with us today. We policy advocates have spent a lot of time over the last couple of years understanding new programs and sources of relief for the charitable sector, be they the Paycheck Protection Program or various tax credits. But we've paid less attention to some other avenues, even if those avenues have been, perhaps totally transformed or reimagined the past couple of years. So again, we're really glad to have Greg Eaton with us today. Thank you, Greg. Take it away.
Thanks, Ben. And it's great to be with everybody today. I'll walk through just a series of short slides here today, and sticking to this agenda, and welcome and introduce myself a little more, and talk about FEMA's public assistance program, the applicability to this group, and talk a little bit about the multiple COVID funding sources, and there are quite a few, and really creates some challenges that need to be considered. Some good challenges for the most part, but just need to be considered. As Ben said, this is who I am. I retired from FEMA. I was a federal coordinating officer. Was my first role at FEMA. That's the senior federal official running presidentially declared disasters. I did that across the country. And then second role at FEMA was the Recovery Division Director in FEMA Region 6, which is Texas and the surrounding states, responsible for the public assistance program, which we're really talking about here today, the declarations process, and the individual assistance program. For perspective, 10 FEMA regions, Region 6 at the time represented about 40% of the nation in public assistance dollars, which was about $1.5 billion a year. In talking about the public assistance program, there's and I'll talk a little more detail. I'll talk a little bit about eligibility, but just understanding where we are here in the response to COVID across the country. Prior to March of 2020, there had never been a pandemic declaration in the history of our country. On March 13th, all 50 states and 6 U.S. territories were granted emergency declaration. Subsequently, now 51 tribes have received a emergency declaration. And so a total of 166 declarations since March of 2020. As far as major disaster declarations, and FEMA looks at them slightly differently from an eligibility standpoint for this event. They're very close. Major disaster declarations do bring some other authorities in, like hazard mitigation. And every state has a hazard mitigation along with their major disaster declaration. Every state has a major disaster declaration. Again, the 6 territories or 5 territories in the District of Columbia and 3 tribes. And each one of those 59 entities has mitigation tied to it. And then it's some individual assistance program, and then category B under public assistance, which is the emergency protective measures. It's the only category that's been authorized, so no permanent work whatsoever. But from a declaration standpoint, it has been interesting as this has evolved. So across all those COVID declarations, there's been a $40.5 billion obligated through to almost 6,500 applicants and over 13,000 project worksheets. So it's been a busy period of time since March of 2020 and moving through all this, the process of submitting projects, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Under the declarations, FEMA is tasked with providing support to meet the emergency needs of the pandemic. It's implementing policy and assistance in a manner consistent with decision-making and applicant supporting documentation. And I word it that way. It's the FEMA claims process is fairly robust and very involved in the requirements and the documentation. So it really is geared to that. But there's many applicants that have not been involved in the process before, and it is quite a process from a documentation standpoint. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then is engaged with the interagency partners and looking at and avoiding a duplication of benefits. As many of these sources, many things can be funded under these same sources. So that strategy of funding is extremely important as you look at the funding available to you. So who's eligible under public assistance? State and local governments, Indian tribal nations, tribal governments, local governments, and then certain private nonprofits. The application process starts with submitting a request for public assistance. That can be a very simple process for governments. For private nonprofits, it's much more involved, and we'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about this in a little more detail, but really the eligible costs for COVID declarations would be the PPE and all masks, gloves, gowns, and some of which in performing of eligible work, others for schools and some of the critical facilities that we'll talk about. Testing and then screening, temperature taking are 4 larger buckets. And then how do you submit applications? Once your RPA is approved, you're compiling eligible costs. You're detailing and providing very detailed documentation supporting those costs, and then you're submitting a streamlined project application. New to FEMA, it's trying to expedite the process of assistance and submitting a claim, but it also comes with about a 36-page manual on how to submit a project. So streamlined and this process don't always quite go together, but it is easier and more simple to submit than most declarations. So from eligibility for a private nonprofit, the criteria that FEMA would look at is here that you own or operate a facility that provides an eligible service. You have a determination from either the federal government or state that you are a private nonprofit. The facility provides a critical service, and which is defined as education, utility, emergency, or medical. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. There's some provisions for non-critical services, but it gets, especially for this again, it gets very complex as far as that eligibility. Often those non-critical facilities would be tied to applying to the SBA for a loan, and then repair of facilities. And then there's other types of facilities that, certainly as we look at this, service to the general public is the key of that last bullet, that you're not restricted at all as far as services you provide for. The 4 critical facilities talk about education and medical. For education, any type of parochial school, certainly public, primary, secondary education, higher education, and then religious ed type schools that provide primary, secondary education are certainly part of this as well. And there have been parochial schools in primary and secondary that have been obligated or awarded grant funding. A lot of what we're seeing for this event, as you can imagine, are in the medical field and in hospitals, private nonprofit hospital systems. A little more detail on what can be funding under public assistance can be provided for. We talked about PPE, cleaning and disinfecting, testing, screening, as a hospital system, all screening everybody that comes into the hospital, that staff and that equipment is all eligible. And then temporary physical barriers. We talked about the permanent work versus what we're talking about here is really temporary work. So if you made permanent modifications to a hospital or a facility, that would not be included in what's been designated under all these declarations. It's more to the tune of a temporary plexiglass, as an example, that at some point would be restored to the original pre-disaster condition. A couple key dates here for consideration. One is not on the screen, but request for public assistance. Normally, that's a 30-day window to apply for to submit your request for public assistance. That window is still open today under all the declarations in whatever state you would be in to submit a request for public assistance. There's a process for that. It's different for every state. So as a state is the recipient of the grant, and you'd be dealing with the state. So that process is a little bit different. Your state emergency management organization would have how to do that within their website, or certainly could point you in the right direction on that. The other 3 key components to the incident period is, one, the public health emergency has been extended by the Secretary of HHS to April 16th. That's done in 90-day increments. So the current expiration of the public health emergency for COVID is April 16th. The Secretary has been extending those just prior to the deadline for, again, that 90-day period. And so that continues. The cost share, currently for all the COVID declarations, the cost share is 100% federal. The president has done this by executive order, and currently the current executive order extends 100% funding to April 1st. April 1st is not the end of the incident period, it's the end of 100% funding. So as we approach April 1st, the president could extend it. If the president does not extend it, the incident period beyond April 1st would be reimbursed to the federal cost share established at that time. Normal declarations are 75 federal, 25 non-federal. So it could go to that breakdown of 75-25, or it could go to 90% federal, 10% non-federal. But again, that will be established as we get to closer to April 1st, or again, the president could extend that. Incident period is open. FEMA has indicated that they will provide a 30-day notice for the closure of the incident period. And then when it's closed, FEMA will likely establish key deadlines as far as submitting projects and requests for public assistance, and all those components that are normal deadlines for the public assistance program, but no decisions have been communicated at this time. So we're certainly watching that when the end of the pandemic and the incident period is being closed, when those things happen in the future. Key points to consider, and this is just much of this, and point number one is really maximizing federal funding. There is a lot of funding sources that are available. Public assistance is only one, and it doesn't fit for everything. There are other funding sources, whether it's the Provider Relief Fund or the Coronavirus Relief Fund under the CARES Act. The American Rescue Plan has significant funding in it. So as you look at each of these costs, there is a strategy to that funding to make sure that you're putting costs in the right bucket, so to speak, to maximize your federal funding. Much of this other components here, and I really want to talk about just the last two. Much of the other things are duplication of benefits, compliance. There's significant compliance requirements to federal grant dollars, disposition of equipment, those type things. For this group, though, donations to start at the end. Donations are a big part of the overall cost for private nonprofits, and this is the receiving of cash donations. For hospital systems, as an example, donations that are very limited in scope often don't help. They always help. Don't get me wrong, but the giving the hospital, in this case, in this example, the flexibility to put these donated funds where other sources of funding don't provide support. As an example, if a donation is specific to PPE is covered by public assistance. So, but if the donation is targeted for that and only for that, it would take away from the ability to use that funding for in another position. With a cost share, the donations can be used to as part of the match for the non-federal cost share. But again, as those dollars are exceeded, then it would take away funding. So just working with the entities where cash is being donated is an important part of that facility or that private nonprofit's ability to maximize their funding. Then legal responsibility, in some cases, Ben, in our conversation the other day, not everybody would fit into that critical facility bucket, if you will, but there are provisions in legal responsibility of the local governments. Often they will hire and bring on private nonprofits to help support their effort, and they would be submitting to FEMA for reimbursement for eligible activities. And then that would be in partnership with the private nonprofit in funding some of those costs and providing whatever the service might be. As an example, feeding programs during COVID early on were an eligible activity, and private nonprofits ran those programs for the local governments. But across the board, compliance critical, duplication of benefits critical, and a strategy for maximizing funding. I know this was quick, and hopefully I didn't talk too fast. But just want to leave you with four thoughts, and then we'll open up to questions. Is that the funding strategy is imperative. You want to maximize your funding across all those funding sources, and there is component things that would be funded through all these federal funding sources that fit better in one bucket versus another. We want to really establish roles and responsibilities and procedures in tracking of all these costs, because it is a cumbersome effort. A lot of guidance with either the public assistance program or the CARES Act funding and provider relief fund makes this very complex. So that those compliance components are even more complex. And then understanding the limits of available funding impacts the services and donations, and how that fits into the overall compliance requirements. And with that, Ben, I'll turn it back to you for questions, if there would be any. Apologize if that was too quick. I wanted to make sure that we allowed time for questions and keep Ben on track.
We really appreciate your depth of expertise, Greg, and trying to help those of us come up to some speed on it. So please do drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I think we can monitor both. So Greg, you very helpfully laid out that there are certain critical facilities, right, to oversimplify schools and hospitals. And then you alluded to functions that are not deemed critical, but that are deemed essential. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is that the same construct as the food pantry program run by a local government that you alluded to earlier, or is there more to dig into there?
A lot of that applies to other type of events where there would be damage to a facility. For this, to look at that food pantry, and they provide a very important service. And in partnering with the local government, there may be support there to expand programs, to provide for, as an example, COVID families that are families that are vulnerable. So where a program to bring dinner to them is very much keeping them safe, and their health and safety. Other components for some of those non-critical facilities, there was a shutdown. There may be some cleaning costs in reopening facilities, but typically that's tied to critical facilities and not like an art. Certainly would be a facility. There may not be eligibility there. I certainly would work with your local public assistance folks, but I have not seen a lot of support provided to those type entities, at least so far. It's more tied to your closing, maybe a one-time cleaning, and then reimbursement for that.
So thank you, Greg. And I think that gets at this question that Jessica is asking us about some theaters successfully pursuing public assistance for what we all might consider routine COVID costs, mitigation costs, and then some being less successful and being told they don't qualify. So it seems like you're saying these theaters are not, by definition, critical facilities, is the phrase Jessica uses, but that they may have differing relationships with a local entity.
So the theaters, in not providing a critical service, now don't construe that with not being very extremely valuable to the community, but the FEMA would look at the performance of eligible work. And that really ties this to COVID and responding to COVID. So a hospital, and that's just easier, or long-term care facilities or nursing homes, those type things. In the treating of COVID patients, there's eligible work being performed. And that would be some of the fine line. I think from a consistency standpoint, And Jessica, I think we in the question talked about inconsistent treatment across the country. I think from a former FEMA person, we are seeing some inconsistency, but that inconsistency is growing smaller and smaller. So again, I would work with the local public assistance team on the eligibility of some of those things. For the most part, the eligibility will be fairly narrow in reopening and in cleaning and disinfecting, probably a one-time cleaning, and then it becomes an operating cost of operating a theater or whatever the case might be.
Great, thank you. So again, I think we have time for another question. Greg, let me ask you, you mentioned the declaration period being extended 90 days at a time. Wes and I spent a lot of time lamenting the federal budget being extended in short time periods. That seems a little silly to me. But have you in your experience gotten any kind of previous indications? You said these things get extended kind of right before 90 days. Has the administration been giving any other signals that they're remain committed to this work, or sort of code for we're going to extend this further, or is everyone really just kind of biting their nails until the last minute?
And the three components of the incident period are very important. So from a public health emergency standpoint under HHS, it's just the normal process of 90 days at a time. From a FEMA perspective and eligibility, the incident period is open. And FEMA will provide the 30-day notice to close it. So action has to be taken to close it. So from a stability of funding, if you will, there from a FEMA perspective under the public assistance program, that's there. It is very, very much a stable funding source in the incident periods open. In all likelihood, it would not be closed by April 1st, given the current surge. And there's hospitals across the country that are at levels equal to or close to wave 1 back in March and April of 20. So from a HHS standpoint, and that 90 days at a time, there are some authorities under HHS that would get extended, but their normal process is 90 days in time. The opioid, public health emergency, same thing. All those are 90 days in time. And the president, in the extension of 100%, that has been, excuse me, very limited. In a fixed time. The last extension by the president to extend 100% funding was done about 30 days in advance. So that was not done at the last minute. It was done early. I would, this is opinion, and certainly the president will do what the president's going to do, but one, it was extended very early on last time. To not extend it creates administrative challenges in the public assistance program. And so I think that's, I'm sure, part of his consideration as he looks to extend or not extend 100% funding.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that, Greg. And good of you as a FEMA guy not to bash the HHS process too much. That's very diplomatic of you. Again, Greg, thank you very, very much for this information. The team at EY and Greg's team at EY obviously have deep expertise in this, and we encourage folks to be in touch with them and with appropriate experts as you seek to navigate this. Obviously, this is a very in-depth, complicated program, and it's far beyond the depth of what we can cover in a quick 30-minute snapshot. But again, we are grateful to you, Greg, for giving us that snapshot and helping folks dive in. So thank you, Greg.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and be safe.
Pleasure. I want to now turn to Wes Coulomb, the managing director at Washington Council Ernst & Young. Wes, I was knocking on Congress a little bit and their habitual can kicking. There are some deadlines coming up that Congress is going to confront, sort of most notably in February. Also, as is the custom, some other things, headline news sort of maybe jumping in front of the queue in Congress. So what can you tell us about the landscape right now and how it's impacting the charitable sector's priorities? Thanks for being with us.
You bet. Yeah, thanks, Ben. So right now, Congress is in recess and they come back next week. As you saw over the winter break, they put a pause on the Build Back Better Act. They passed a CR until February 18th, and so it left a lot of things out there to be addressed as they come back, and they've slowly come back. The Senate did put those items on hold and put the voting rights legislation ahead of that. We saw the failed cloture votes last week, and no change in the filibuster rules. So that's kind of been run its course. So I think will not be the last of it, of course, but if right now I think there's not more short-term action on that issue for the time being. The two big issues out there need to address are, as you mentioned, the federal funding, the CR omnibus package that expires on February 18th. That seems to be kind of the front burner issue at the moment in the House and the Senate as they approach that deadline. There has been some conversations amongst the Republicans and Democrats. As you know, it needs to be on a bipartisan basis in order to get the omnibus package through the Congress and to the president's desk, and so there'll need to be some cooperation there. I think there is interest amongst the Republicans to work with Democrats on a package. One of the holdups has been some of the policy riders that were included in the appropriations bills last Congress under Republican, under President Trump and Republicans put in there, and the question of whether they can carry those over in the new omnibus package and appropriations bills or not. There's also the issue of overall funding. I think the funding and the dollar amounts are likely to get resolved. There's traditionally been willingness by Republicans are pushing more defense spending, and the Democrats to push non-defense spending, and they reach an agreement, usually to increase both in order to get the bill passed. And that's kind of the way it's gone over the last several years. And so that'll get likely resolved. The question is, can they do it by February 18th, or will they need to have another short-term extension? I don't think anybody wants to do a full, well, not anybody, there's some, but I don't think the powers that be on both sides want to do a full year CR. So I think that we don't get it put together and voted on by the February 18th, and there will be a short-term extension of a week or two, potentially 2 weeks, giving some more breathing room to get the bill done and finalized. But they're still trying to meet the February 18th deadline on that package. Now, talking about disaster relief, there is, as you know, several disasters that took place, natural disasters, not the COVID disaster declaration that took place the last year or so. And so we have seen in the past some disaster relief put in the omnibus package, looking back to the disaster that took place in the previous year. For example, hurricanes, et cetera, took place, the winter storms in the Midwest, et cetera. So there'll be some possible accommodation for that in the omnibus package. And that could include an employee retention tax credit that's traditionally part of the disaster package. Now, it's targeted to disaster zones and part disaster piece, and not broad base as the sector's been trying to push for extension of the other ERTC as part of the COVID relief package, which is separate. But we're just thinking that there is some conversations there on retention credits as part of on this package. They do a tax title in the bill. So that's kind of on the agenda. I think that's kind of the pressing issue they have to deal with in the coming weeks. Obviously, the Build Back Better Act is still out there. Senator Manchin is really kind of the focus of trying to reach an agreement. He, I think, has been pushing back on the size and scope A lot of the issues that are on the table, the child tax credit, the energy package, et cetera, are still being negotiated as part of that. President Biden in his recent comments, made mention of maybe scaling back the package or doing it in pieces. I think that, given that you only have one shot at reconciliation, doing it in pieces is probably not likely to happen unless they kind of break it out as just a test vote. But they really have one reconciliation bill, so they can't really do 3 reconciliation bills. They can only do one, so they kind of pick where they can get passed in the Senate. So I think that those negotiations are going to take place. Probably not see anything until after the omnibus package is resolved in February. There is some push to get it done by March 1st, which the president's going to have a State of the Union address before the nation, before Congress on March 1st. But I think that's probably ambitious time frame, given what's on their plate between now and then. Then you also have the traditional extender provisions that expired end of this last year, including the charitable deduction. Other provisions out there, the energy piece, like there's 30 or more in that bucket. They have gone in the past on omnibus packages, but my conversation with folks is that the urgency to do them in this omnibus package is not quite there yet. Unless those conversations change, they do have an effort on a bipartisan basis to put them in that package. We'll probably not see those get addressed until, traditionally it's happened in like a lame duck session, right, in December in the fall, which is unfortunate for people who care about these credits, but it's been kind of the routine habit of Congress to do that on a retroactive basis in years past. Obviously, we don't get a Build Back Better plan. The child tax credit is one that's been popular to get done and extended. Some Republicans have been pushing for child tax credit expansion, obviously different than what the Build Back Better plan had. I think it'd probably be hard to get one done on a bipartisan basis, but there will be some interest on that potentially going forward as well. So that's also out there on the list. It's kind of all that's on the table at the moment. Obviously, the big announcement today with Justice Breyer announcing his retirement. That's not going to heat up for a good month or two. He'll be in his seat until at least the current term, which ends in end of June. They can obviously fulfill that, make a nomination and have those hearings and votes before he actually retires in June. So it could happen in late spring, early summer, or maybe not until in the summer itself. But that's also going to take some attention, especially in the Senate side, to deal with that as well.
It has
I'll
always
stop
been,
there and have to answer any questions.
Thank you, Wes. Yeah, it's always been unfair that the legislative body that takes the longest to do things also has the most things that they need to do. Right? Add nominations to their plate.
That's right.
Need to do some organizational rethinking, perhaps. In the US Congress. So you alluded to tax extenders, and I think you make an excellent point, Wes. Before we go back to appropriations, that some of the traditional what could have been the horse that pulls the cart, something like the expired child tax credit, but with that caught up in the reconciliation and the Build Back Better conversation, it feels like those of us who are working on other expired tax provisions may not have much to hitch our cart to belabor the metaphor in the meantime. So as we look back at the appropriations process, I want to flag a question from our friend George Moros. So we've talked a little bit about the schedule for trying to get this round of appropriations done. This is also the time of year when subcommittees would be, starting to gather input from members under a normal appropriations process. So, what can you tell us or foresee about earmarks in any, FY23 package, or in the process that's starting this year?
Yeah, good question. So as they try to wrap up their overdue work for FY 2022, right. They still have to deal with 2023 going forward to this September, right? Traditionally, they have the luxury or have the previous year's omnibus package done, and the president then submits his budget to Congress. It's going to be hard for OMB to put their budget together for FY23 without knowing the final numbers for 2022, right? And so the ideal situation would be, not ideal, but the likely situation is they wait till that package is done, and then they put together their budget. I think the president already has his budget mostly drafted. I would imagine it's pretty much ready to go, given we're, end of January, it's usually pretty much ready to go by the 1st of February, right? But you don't have the numbers for 22 yet to plug in what they want for 23. So I would expect they would not put anything out until that has been resolved, and that builds into what they do for 2023, and that kind of kicks off the congressional hearing process for appropriators in the House and Senate to do their work on the FY23 process. So, it's going to, obviously, given they haven't done their work on the 22, it's going to delay the 23 activity. They still have to get that done this year as well. So that will kick off, and then you'll have traditional process of members making their requests, their earmark requests to the appropriators. Appropriators will have their subcommittee hearings on various topics, etc. Various committees will have their views and budget views and estimates letters to the appropriators, the budget committee, right? And then the question is, does the Congress actually do a budget resolution for 23 to then set the parameters of the terms of the appropriations for 2023? And if in years past, they haven't done a budget sometimes, and they've just deemed the top line numbers. Technically, the Democrats can pass another budget and do another reconciliation bill for 23 if they want to. I think that the view is that's pretty unlikely, given they've had a pretty much hard time passing the first reconciliation bill for the last 9 months. So unlikely to probably do another one. But that still is on the table. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. I think you talk about continuing resolutions. Usually, no one likes continuing resolutions. It seems like the military and defense community are often particularly up in arms about the prospect of that. This year, we've also seen people with a vested interest in a number of the transportation formula funding programs sort of galvanized against a CR, because the CR holds back some of those investments that many people fought really hard for in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Exactly.
So I want to give folks one more chance for ask questions of Wes about what you have heard on the landscape for government funding, for Build Back Better, for tax extenders. Seeing none at the moment, I have a few other updates for you on this cold, sunny afternoon in Washington, D.C. The employee retention tax credit that Wes mentioned has been, I think, as regular listeners know, a real focus for IS and for many of our colleagues. Bipartisan legislation was introduced at the end of last year, HR 6161, to restore the fourth quarter of that tax credit. And IS and others have been advocating as part of a really fun coalition with the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector on behalf of that legislation. The last we saw, that legislation had 48 co-sponsors officially listed and was quickly gaining them. There may certainly be more in the works. We have also been in conversation with a number of Senate offices, and we do expect bipartisan Senate legislation to restore the fourth quarter 2021 ERTC to be introduced early next week. So we look forward to working with many of you on those continued efforts, and hope we can stay in touch about them. If you'd like to get involved in that coalition in endorsing that bill, please let us know. Wes also mentioned the failure of the voting rights package that Democrats cobbled together of a couple different bills in the Senate. And I know that everyone is probably aware of that legislation's fate, I did want to share a statement that Independent Sector and the United Philanthropy Forum released upon the failure of that legislation. That statement references a letter that our friends at the forum led, which I know a number of folks' names I recognize today signed. So thank you all for joining that effort. And thank you, Wes, for the update on the prospects of that legislation. We will keep at it. Undeterred, I believe, is the word my boss used. Lastly, an update on nonprofit jobs, a critical marker that we all watch, also a critical talking point for many of us. So the final report from the Center for Civil Society Studies at Johns Hopkins University was released for December, and that nonprofits added 9,000 jobs during December, which is still a very small slice of the over 400,000 jobs still missing from the sector's peak before the pandemic. The center is estimating that it'll take the sector 11 months to return to its pre-COVID levels. That's a longer time period than they had been estimating recently. So, as we think about opportunities to advance legislation that helps our sector serve its community, certainly the financial pain for charitable organizations appears to be stretched out. And we're really sorry to see the center closing at Hopkins. We look forward to working with Chelsea Newhouse and her colleagues in their new capacities elsewhere. That's really important data for all of us. So I want to pause one last time for questions about those updates or about the landscape as Wes laid it out for you. All right. I want to thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you, Wes. Thank you, Greg. And again, most of all, thank all of you for tuning in, for standing with us, and for advocating on these issues that means so much to the sector and the people we serve. We'll look forward to talking to you all soon.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you much.